And welcome into Gator Bytes on the 1010XL.com podcast network, also being simulcast on the Florida Gator 1010XL Facebook page. Today's Gator podcast is brought to you by Southeast Orthopedic Specialists. They're Northeast Florida's leading orthopedic center, providing an unparalleled level of care across numerous locations in both Jacksonville and St. Augustine. That includes Riverside, Northside, the South Side, the beaches, Fleming Island, and St. John's. He is Graham Marsh. I'm the hacker, Ryan Green. The month of May has arrived. The NFL draft is in the rearview mirror. Spring football is in the rearview mirror, and we're getting very, very close to preseason magazines hitting the newsstands. Graham, it's been a little while, man. How are you?
It has, Hack. I've been starting to miss you, my man.
It's been a while. Yeah, I mean, look, we try to do these ever so often when news warrants. And I think news is warranted over the last couple of days. We'll get into some over-under win projections for Florida. And, boy, that's a grim-looking situation. Some of the preseason magazines that are coming out. Recruiting seems to be going pretty well right now. We'll get into that in a moment. But I want to start with what happened on draft weekend. Certainly want to spend some time on Ventrell Miller coming here to Jacksonville. Before we do that, Anthony Richardson, top 5 to the Indianapolis Colts, becomes one of the highest drafted Florida Gator quarterbacks of all time. I believe only after Steve Spurrier, who went number 3 in the mid to late 60s. Richardson goes 4 to Indianapolis. Your thoughts on AR to the Colts and the fact the Jaguars are going to have to play him twice a year for the foreseeable future?
I thought, in terms of just a draft analysis perspective and who he was as a prospect, I thought that it was good for him to go. First of all, it was just good for him in general. Like, great. He gets to change his family's future because of all the work he's put in. Absolutely earned it. Great. Like, bravo. All those guys that get to change their families' lives, and that's awesome to see. That's one of the reasons we love the draft so much. Anyway, besides that, Anthony Richardson as a prospect, I felt like it was really, really good for him that the Colts did go ahead and snag him at 4, because I do believe had they not snagged him at 4, there was a potential for Anthony to suffer a similar fate that Will Levis did and maybe not go all the way to the second round like Levis did, but still fall pretty substantially. As you kind of saw, the way, and this happens every year in the draft when there's like 3 to 4 quarterbacks. Isn't there always one that always slips far?
Yeah, you forget Aaron Rodgers was taken, 25th overall? Yeah,
exactly. And we kind of fail to realize every year. I'm not saying you and me necessarily, just the general draft guy. A lot of times we fail to realize that quarterback is a different position to draft than any other position, because if you draft a quarterback in the first round, you are placing your franchise in that guy's hands for the next 10 years. So you better be pretty damn sure that's the guy you believe in. And I think despite some of the production shortcomings of Anthony Richardson and Will Levis, I think Anthony Richardson, correct me if you disagree with me, I think Anthony Richardson gives you more to potentially be excited about and convince yourself of than potentially Will Levis did. So, going to the Colts at 4, I thought it was either go really, really early or have a pretty steep fall.
Well, Shane Steichen, the new coach of Indianapolis, we know what he did with Jalen Hurts in Philadelphia. You also have the situation where Gardner Minshew is up there. Anthony Richardson has been working out with Gardner Minshew, with our friend Denny Thompson at 6 points. So there's a lot of familiarity. It's a good situation for Anthony Richardson to be in. Now, let me ask you. You are a Gator alum. You are also a diehard Jacksonville Jaguar fan. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn there. If anybody has seen your social media pages last year when the Jaguars made their runs, you were pretty fired up.
I got a little cut on my right arm and orange and blue came out. I got a little cut on my left arm and teal came out.
Yeah, so. There was you're too young to remember this. Some of our listeners will. Back in the day, there was a shirt called the Jagators. It was called the fiercest animal on planet Earth. And I actually have one of those shirts, half Jaguar, half Gator, the Jagators.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, no, I got the shirt. It's terrific. I'm sure people out there remember it. Let me ask you, as we move forward here with Anthony Richardson in the AFC South, do you, I guess fear is not the right word, but your thoughts on a Gator Jaguar scenario. You were a fan of Anthony in college. Is he now the enemy because he's part of the Indianapolis Colts? Where do you fall on that situation?
Yes, he's the enemy.
No question.
Yeah, it's that simple, man. And again, it's nothing against Anthony Richardson personally. I really enjoyed him at Florida. I think also something that I don't think we appreciate enough in athletes is when they're just extremely good people. Anthony is a phenomenal human
he's
being.
a great dude.
I witnessed him after the LSU game. I was at that game. I witnessed him. A tough loss, man. Like, at the end of the game, I think you might remember Jason Marshall got an interception, and it was, in my opinion, a phantom pass interference call.
Yeah.
Or not pass interference, it was roughing the passer.
Right.
Gervon Dexter. In my opinion, a bad call. If that's still an interception, I think Florida wins that game. Anyway, the point is, that's an emotional, really tough loss to a huge rival at home. All the reason in the world for a quarterback to be just furious, not want to talk to anybody, and do the kind of, to use an NBA example, to kind of do the Dylan Brooks recently where he didn't want to talk to the media and he's storming off and kind of that stuff. I witnessed Anthony Richardson after that game have a bunch of kids come up to him and him sit there and sign autographs and hang out with kids and take pictures for probably 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just a little glimpse into like how good of a person he is and how awesome he is and how it means nothing personal at all. But he plays for the Colts.
Yeah,
it's that simple.
I feel the same way now that I did when Derrick Henry went to Tennessee. Derrick Henry was a friend of the station. We had Derrick Henry in studio a bunch when he was here at Yulee High School in the Jacksonville area, and it's like, man, you had to go to Tennessee, you know? So the Jaguars had to deal with you, and still do. Twice a year, same thing now with Anthony Richardson. Quickly to the Jaguars, they did draft a Florida Gator in round 4. You could argue the Anthony Richardson of the defense last year was Ventrell Miller. The Jaguars take him in round 4. Thought it was a little high, but I like the pick. And this is a Gator podcast, not to get too much into the Jaguars here, but I think Ventrell Miller is a guy that can come in, help on the defense, solidify the middle linebacker unit to an extent with Chad Muma, and maybe you can move some other guys around on the Jaguar defense now. But I love the fact that Ventrell Miller is in Jacksonville. I just thought round 4, maybe a smidge too high.
And I think Ventrell, and I think part of the reason that the Jaguars probably did reach a little bit to snag him was I normally don't put a whole lot of stock in this, but Ventrell Miller is an extremely good leader, locker room guy, like really good fit for teams, like one of those kind of chameleon type players that any locker room he goes into, he's going to be a great addition to. And again, I normally wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in that. I'm kind of like, you need talent. But looking at the Jaguar season last year, like that team had real chemistry, man. Not every team has that. A lot, like chemistry is kind of a buzzword.
Well, they're looking for a certain type of person. I mean,
Right.
The player is obviously you want a good player, but it's clear at this point with Doug Peterson and Trent Baalke you're doing in Jacksonville is they're drafting certain type of people that are leaders, that are good with other guys, obviously, like you're talking about the chemistry, and Ventrell Miller fits that to a T.
100%. And Ventrell, kind of similar to Anthony Richardson this past year, with the way their season went, and I'm sure it obviously wasn't the way a lot of those guys, especially who kind of knew it was probably going to be their last year in Gainesville, I'm sure it's not the way they wanted it to end. But every time, man, gracious with the media, gracious with fans, like just good people, good locker room guys, never causing problems. They just put their head down, they go to work, they lead other guys. Ventrell is perfect for that role. I think he can learn a lot behind Foye Oluokun, and I think it's a great fit. The key with him is going to be health. If he can stay healthy, then I think there's a spot for him to play.
Talk about cone drills, 40-yard dashes, vertical jumps, all that stuff. That means something. I'm not going to say it doesn't. You have 53 guys on a roster. Give me about 50 or 51 guys that can do that. At the end of the day, I want 1 or 2 football players. Ventrell Miller is a football player. He may not be the fastest in the cone drill. He may not run the fastest 40.
Andrew Wingard is that guy.
Yeah,
on
right.
The team right in Jacksonville.
Ventrell might not have the biggest broad jump, but on a 3rd down and 5, when the running back catches a screen, Ventrell Miller is going to tackle him before the first down marker. And that's what I want. So I am very happy with Ventrell Miller coming to Jacksonville. Today's Gator Bytes podcast is brought to you by Southeast Orthopedic Specialists. For the highest quality care, you can rely on Southeast Orthopedic Specialists for any orthopedic injury or concern. You can log on to their website by going to se-ortho.com, and you can listen for Southeast Orthopedic Specialist, the good doctor, Kevin Murphy, on Thursday mornings in the 7 o'clock hour with Jeff and Dan right here on 1010XL for his weekly analysis of injuries in sports. We mentioned preseason magazines, Athlon, Wendy's, a couple of weeks from coming out. Phil Steele will be a little later. But we're starting to get an inkling into some of the websites. On3 in particular is the one I'm going to reference, a couple out of in Vegas too, with the over-under win totals, the projections for 2023. And normally when a website like On3, a reputable website, puts their over-under win projections for all 14 SEC schools, when you're Florida, you don't go looking at the bottom, right? You look in the middle towards the top.
When you're on your phone, you don't have to scroll your thumb that many times.
So On3 did this, I think, last week, and obviously Georgia and Alabama were at the top with 10.5 or whatever win projections. And I'm scrolling and I'm scrolling and I'm scrolling, and there's Florida 13 out of 14 in the conference with an over-under projection of 5.5 wins. 5.5 wins, which obviously would not get you to a bowl game. It's nothing more than a talking point. We are in the month of May. But, Graham, I do think it goes to show you that we're not alone in this thinking. The national perception of Florida is that they could potentially really struggle this year.
Yeah, 100%. And I think from the national perspective, obviously there's no bias. They don't care about the University of Florida at all. They don't care about their success.
Are you saying we talk out of orange and blue goggles sometimes?
A time or two. There might be a filter every so often. Those glasses of yours may have a couple filters.
Or as you referenced earlier, you cut open your arm and orange and blue blood is spilling out. Yeah.
However, I would say that for sure you've been on radio for a while now, kind of speaking your opinions and stuff, and I think it's very clear with you. And then also, I'm not behind a mic quite as much, but kind of the same thing. I think both of us do have the ability to really look at things realistically and be like, okay, here's what I may want to happen, but here's what's going to happen. And we've talked about this in multiple podcasts before this. Part of it is that Florida is not as talented and not as good as Gator Nation would like them to be. And a lot of that still goes back to Dan Mullen and not recruiting up to par. And of course, Billy Napier is working to change that currently, but that's especially when you're really fixing the recruiting at the high school level, that takes multiple years, because not only do they need to get in the program, not only do you need to get those guys to commit, but you got to get them in the program, you got to develop them, you got to get them to be good college players. So it's a whole step that's going to take more than just last year and this year for Billy Napier to get there. Mm-hmm. All that said, the current Florida Gators roster is just not that good, and their schedule is ridiculously hard.
Well, that's where I totally agree with you. I mean, I look at the schedule, and we'll talk about this up until the season when it kicks off Labor Day night or Labor Day weekend, I guess, against Utah there in Salt Lake City. Again, Florida fans, find me 8 wins on that schedule. To me, it doesn't exist. I thought it was very telling. I have Brent Beard on every week. He does podcasts with a lot of folks around the region, Shane Matthews being one of them, the former Gator quarterback.
Love listening to Shane talk Gators.
Yeah, it's great. And Brent told me that on one of their recent podcasts, Shane said Florida could win 8 games. Now, think about that comment for a second. Could win 8 games. And I think that's being ambitious, but you're saying Florida could be 8-4. That's the realistic expectation from a Gator great like Shane Matthews. And you look at that, all right, let's say 8 wins. That means other than Utah, LSU, Georgia, and Florida State, which Florida will be huge underdogs in all those games. Agreed?
Double digit.
Utah, LSU, Georgia, Florida State. They would need to win every other game to get to 8. That means beating Tennessee. That means going to Kentucky and winning. That means going to South Carolina and winning. That means going to Missouri and winning. That means beating Arkansas. I just don't see it. I mean, now maybe they upset an LSU in Baton Rouge. I doubt it. Maybe they upset a Utah and Salt Lake City on opening Thursday night. I doubt it. They're not beating Georgia. I would highly doubt they're going to beat Florida State. Again, find me 8 wins on that schedule, and I just don't think it exists.
The other thing that a lot of people fail to do when they look at the schedule is it's easy to look through the schedule and look at every game very isolated in terms of will Florida win that game based on their roster versus the other roster, home or away, all that. But what a lot of people don't think about is like you have to kind of think of the season as one entire body of work. Like I would say the Florida-Utah game, you can look at it that way because it's week 1. But you can also look at it and say that's a crowd in Utah that hasn't had football in months. They're starving for it. They're getting revenge.
Yeah, when's the last time an SEC team went in there on opening night?
Right.
You think that crowd's not going to be a little bit fired up?
They're going to be going crazy.
Yeah.
And then you look throughout the rest of the schedule. I mean, Kentucky and Tennessee, I haven't looked actually. I don't remember specifically when each game is. But Kentucky and Tennessee, I'm sure, are either back-to-back or close like they normally are. Florida State, that game's always late in the season. Man, I know it's Florida State. I know it's a rivalry. But, man, if Florida's had a horrible year by that point, and if Florida State has the kind of year a lot of people think they may have, not only is it that you probably currently believe Florida State's a better football team than Florida, but also you're going to be dealing with a team that's got really low confidence and a team that's got sky-high confidence at the end of the year.
With probably about 15 or 20,000 Seminole fans in Gainesville.
Right, exactly. So, like, you have to consider where the teams will possibly be at when that Saturday comes throughout the season.
And look, am I saying it's impossible to believe Florida goes into Utah and wins? No, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not going to predict it to happen. Is it impossible for Florida to go to Baton Rouge and win? No, although I think we're getting more into the difficult realm at that point. At this point, I don't believe they're going to beat Georgia. We mentioned Florida State. And then, again, you got to go to Kentucky. You got to go to South Carolina, and you got to go to Missouri. Those are 3 road games.
You haven't won in Kentucky since 2019, by the way.
Right.
You haven't won since the Kyle Trask taking over for Felipe Franks game.
And you want to talk about revenge games? South Carolina played their worst game of the year against Florida, and all they did after that was beat Clemson and beat Tennessee. So I just... We'll see what happens, but I think it's telling when these magazines and even some former players, and I'm not singling out Shane or anybody. I mean, I've talked to a lot of former players that believe this, that if things fall Florida's way, they could win 8 or 9 games. 9, I think, is a pipe dream, but it just goes to show you what the realistic expectations are. I want to move on to recruiting as we get ready to end. I will say this about Gator fans, though. Granted, it hasn't happened yet, but I get the sense here early on in the month of May, middle part of May, there's more understanding. Gator fans are aware of what 2023 is going to be. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of venom and fury and anger necessarily like we might expect from Gator Nation, because I think they know the limitations of this team coming into this year.
I disagree, and here's why. Because I've heard a couple people echo kind of that general sentiment as well, like on Twitter and stuff like that. The reason I disagree is because I think right now you're absolutely right. But I think it's easy for members of Gator Nation to say that on May 12th.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But we see this every year. Every team, every fan of a team has even the most realistic and maybe even pessimistic fans have certain expectations, how they think things are going to go down, and they break it down this way, right? Before the season, this time of year, and they're breaking all this stuff down. But when football season comes, the emotion of, especially if you're a Gator fan, the emotion of being in the swamp and getting up for stuff and here come the Gators and singing Won't Back Down and all that, and then losing to rivals where it's important for you to beat them, all those emotions catch up to you during football season. And it all happens at once. So all those emotions hit you at once, good or bad. So when it's bad, those emotions snowball. And by the end of the year, if Florida's not any good, I think the rumblings will be much louder than we may anticipate in May, because it's easy to be chill about it in May.
See, here's what I think last year. And I don't think either one of us are wrong, but last year you beat Utah, which caught some people off guard. You get a big win on opening night, and you had Anthony Richardson. And because of that, I think the expectations were blown out of proportion. Thus, you go 6-6. It's a huge failure. You're not expecting to beat Utah now, and Anthony Richardson's gone. You got 6 guys that went to the NFL draft. You had a bunch of undrafted free agents. You lost a lot of really good players. I think realistic Gator fans, that might be an interesting word for some Gator fans. I think realistic Gator fans understand it's Graham Marsh this year. It's not Anthony Richardson. Now, if you are a diehard, bleed orange and blue, orange goggles, you're going to fire coach.com after one loss, well, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking about to the realistic Gator fans out there. I would sign on for 7-5 right now.
Me too.
If you tell me 7-5 right now for Florida in 2023, I would take my pen. I would sign on the dotted line. I'd say, yep, I'll take it. And I'll go to the Gator Bowl, or I'll go to the Birmingham Bowl, or whatever. To me, 7-5 would be a successful season.
I agree. And let me ask you this. Let's say that did happen. Gators went 7-5. And let's even sweeten the deal a little bit. Let's say they go 7-5 and they win the bowl game. In 2024, do they need to then win 8-9 in 2024?
That's a good. Well, let's get there, because there needs to be a gradual improvement. I agree, and that gets us to recruiting. Today's Gator Bytes podcast is brought to you by Southeast Orthopedic Specialists. They're Northeast Florida's leading orthopedic center, providing an unparalleled level of care across numerous locations in both Jacksonville and St. Augustine. That includes Riverside, Northside, the South Side, the beaches, Fleming Island, and St. John's. 2024, I think, is a huge year for Billy Napier, and it's shaping up to be his best recruiting class. As lackluster as the expectations are about 2023, Graham, recruiting seems to be going well. I mean, Florida's got a borderline top 10 class right now. They just got another big commitment with the 4-star Isaiah Williams, the 4-star kid. And then you got another 5-star kid from Ohio State in Jeremiah Smith, who is going to be on campus with DJ Lagway for a visit. Jeremiah Smith is currently committed to Ohio State. So lackluster expectations for 2023, sure, as we've talked about. Yet, Florida seems to be finding some pretty good footing on the recruiting trail.
Yeah, and they have to continue that. Because of that, because of the success in recruiting, and based on everything Billy Napier's kind of shown us so far, I have to believe it's only going to continue. The success is only going to continue, if not improve. Again, it's just making sure that with all of this said, Billy Napier can find himself enough wins on the field in the next 2 years to keep his job.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, again, I'm not firing him right now. That's not what I'm saying. It is irrational to try to fire, even if this year's not super successful. It's still a little bit irrational and impatient to try to fire somebody. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying at some point, not winning enough games on the field will catch up.
Sure. But
maybe that's after 3 years. Maybe that's after 4. I don't know. He just needs to figure out a way. Mike Norvell did that this past season. And it's a little bit easier because he got an easier schedule. So that's fair. But Norvell, in my opinion, while he's kind of building the program, he bought himself some extra wins with a lot of success in the portal. That's where I'd still like to see more from Billy Napier, because I would like to see more guys in the portal that can contribute right now.
Yeah, Norvell did have an easier schedule, although far be it for me to give Florida State credit for their schedule. They did beat LSU, Florida, Oklahoma, and Miami last year. Those are pretty good wins for Florida State from where they were, obviously. Here's the thing about, and we talked about this, I think, a couple weeks ago, patience, man. Again, if Billy Napier doesn't turn it around after year 3, well, then there's a conversation to be had. Florida State showed patience with Mike Norvell, and it has paid off. You got to give the guy 3 years. 3 full years. So I don't really necessarily care what happens in 2023, assuming Florida doesn't go like 1-11. All right, if they go 1-11 or 2-10, well, that might change a little bit. But assuming it's not a catastrophe football-wise, Napier's going to be the coach in 2024. He deserves to be the coach in 2024. And after year number 3, then you can give a really solid evaluation. This applies to Miami, too. Miami needs to show patience with Cristobal. Florida needs to show patience with Napier, just like they did with Norvell in Tallahassee. Quickly, I'll end with this. Florida's got 8 commitments in their 2024 class. 7 of them are 4 or 5-star commitments. 7 of them are ranked in the top 340 players in America. Of course, the class is headlined by 5-star DJ Lagway. You got one of the top safeties in Xavier Filsamy, one of the top linebackers and Adarius Hayes, Miles Graham. I mean, you have some serious talent on this Gator 2024 recruiting class. They're in play for a lot of other guys as well. So there seems to be a disconnect. Expectations for the fan base are very low. Yeah, whatever Billy Napier, the Gators, NIL, whatever they're doing recruiting-wise, seems to be working right now because they're building a heck of a class.
Again, I totally agree. It's just a lot of these guys are not going to be Florida Gators contributing on the field for like 2 years.
Yeah.
So,
no, DJ Lagway might be the starting quarterback this time next year.
Depending on what happens.
Yeah.
That's not wrong. I do agree with you overall, though. There was Florida's program needed to be stripped down to its studs and built anew. And Billy Napier has been willing to do that, and I think Scott Strickland was willing to do that as well. I think it was clear when Napier was hired that, hey, we are ready to start this thing over and build it up the right way. And so we're done putting Band-Aids on things. Dan Mullen, in a lot of ways, was a Band-Aid. There were clear problems in terms of recruiting, and there were clear problems in terms of the infrastructure of the program and how they do business. But Mullen is such a good coach in terms of squeezing out extra talent for a team that might not be quite as good. He's such a good, overachieving coach, making an average team pretty good, that it felt good for a while. And it felt like a nice Band-Aid. Obviously, that ran its course. Mullen had to go, and it was time to kind of blow everything up and start anew. And it's clear that was the vision. So based on kind of everything we've been saying about time, I do believe that Strickland understood that this was going to be a multi-year thing. So I do believe it will be very tough to not give Napier those full 3 years like you're talking about. I would almost assume for sure that he will be given that amount of time.
That is Graham Marsh. I'm the hacker Ryan Green. This is Gator Bytes on the 1010XL.com podcast network and on the Florida Gator 1010XL Facebook page. Thank you to Southeast Orthopedic Specialists. We'll be back in a couple of weeks as we begin to inch so much closer to preseason magazines, summer conditioning, and we're less than 2 months away until SEC Media Days.